Hello and welcome. Today we are going to go over Unit 1, Day 3 notes, which is one-step equations. So let's go ahead and get started. What is an equation? An equation is basically a statement that says two things are equal. It's basically an expression with an equal sign. Okay, so what is an example of an equation? 3x plus 7 equals 9. This is considered an equation because there's an equal sign. What about not an equation? What's an example that is not an equation? 3x plus 7. This is actually considered an expression because it's just a mathematical statement. The first example is an equation because there's an equal sign. Okay? So now let's go ahead and work out our one-step equations. The goal of any type of equation is to solve for the value of x, to find what thus x equal. So let's look at example number 1. I will get a highlighter or a color pencil of your choice. When I'm solving equations, I always like to highlight the variable, and in this case, it's just the letter x. And the one thing you have to remember when you're doing equations is that if you do it to one side of the equal sign, you also have to do it to the other side. Now, I also like to draw a little vertical line on top of the equal sign. This doesn't mean the two statements are not equal. It just allows you to be able to see how you're moving the numbers from one side to the other side of the equal sign. Okay, so if you notice, my equation says x plus 1 equals 4. First thing I want to do is I want to move the constant, the number that's right beside the x, on the same side of the x. So that number will be plus 1. Now if I jailbreak that number across the equal sign to the other side, I'm literally picking that number up and moving it to the other side. But the only way I can move it to the other side is by doing the opposite of the operation. So the operation is plus 1. So what's the opposite of plus 1? Minus 1. Now this number is no longer here because we literally picked it up and moved it over to the other side. We jailbreak. Okay? Now all I have to do is bring down the x. I have the x left on the left side of the equal sign. And what do I have now left over on the right side? 4 minus 1 is 3. So my final answer is x equals 3. Now, if you wanted to check your answer, you could take your answer and plug it back into your original equation. So what is 3, which is the x? 3 plus 1, does it give me 4? It does, so the problem is correct. Yeah, example number 2. Once again, I'm going to highlight the variable, and I want to move everything away that's on the same side of the x, on the same side of the equal sign, okay, with the x. So this 3 has to go to the other side. So I'm going to jailbreak that 3. So what's the opposite of plus 3? Minus 3. So I'm going to drop the x, drop my equals. What's negative 5 minus 3? Negative 8. So my final answer is x equals negative 8. Example 3. If you notice, on the left side, I have my variable, but I also have an 8. That 8 has to move over to the other side because we don't want the x to be with anyone. Okay? The x is antisocial. It hates being in the same room with anyone else. So that means we have to move the 8 out of this room to the other room. So if I move this 8 from one side to the other side, I jailbreak it. So what's the opposite of a plus 8? Minus 8. So the 8 is no longer on this side of the equal sign. It got moved to the other side. So x equals, what is 9 minus 8? 1. So my answer is x equals 1. Now, at this moment, you will need to pause the video so you can have the opportunity to work these two problems out. Okay, so now I am going to give you the answers to the two problems. Problem number 1, x equals 9. My mistake, x equals negative 9. Number 2 is x equals 3. Now, if you do not get these problems correct, you're welcome to ask me tomorrow in class, and I will explain them to you in detail. Okay, subtraction problems. Now, you do the same thing with subtraction problems or with these types of problems. The only difference is that instead of starting off with addition, you are starting off with subtraction. So let's go ahead and do the first thing that I've been doing, which is highlighting the variable and putting down that line over the equal sign so I can be able to tell the difference between the left side and the right side. Now, if you notice, on the left side, it's x minus 1. X hates being with other people, other numbers. It's antisocial. So the purpose of these problems is that we need to make sure that x is by itself. Therefore, I need to move the negative 1 over to the other side, so I'm going to jailbreak it. I'm going to literally move it from this side of the equal sign to the other. So what's the opposite of a minus 1? Plus 1. So on the left side, I'm left with x, and then bring down your equals. 4 plus 1 is 5. So my answer is x equals 5. Okay, example number 2. Highlight your x. Draw your line over the equal sign. And you can always go ahead and just put an equal sign just so you'll have it, because you're going to have to bring it down anyways. And it helps you with not forgetting that the equal sign belongs there. Now, on the left side, I have x minus 3. So I need to move that minus 3 to the other side because x has to be by itself. I'm going to pick up the negative 3 and throw it to the other side. So what's the opposite of a minus 3? Plus 3. So on the left side, I'm left with x. On the right side, I have negative 5 plus 3. Negative 5 plus 3 is just negative 2. So my final answer is x equals negative 2. Okay, example number 3. Same idea. Highlight that variable. Draw yourself that line on top of the equal sign and go ahead and draw yourself another equal symbol down here because you're going to have to bring it down anyways. This is an equation, so an equation requires an equal sign. Now, on the left side, I have negative 8 plus 8. Negative 8 plus x. Therefore, I need to move the negative 8 to the other side because x has to be by itself. So I'm going to pick up negative 8, throw it to the other side. I'm going to jailbreak it. And to be able to do that, I do the opposite of the symbol. So what's the opposite of minus 8? Plus 8. Now, on the left side of the equal sign, I have x left over. What about the right side? Well, what's 9 plus 8? 17. Therefore, my final answer is x equals 17. And I have solved my problem. Now, of course, you could plug in your final answers back to your original equation so you can check your answer. Okay, so for example, example 3. If I take the 17 and plug it into where the x is at, really you're just doing -8 plus 17 equals 9. And let's see if this statement is true. -8 plus 17 does give me 9, so 9 equals 9, so my answer is correct. And you could do this for all the problems that we've done so far, so you can be able to check your answer. Okay, go ahead and pause the video so you can have the opportunity to work out problems number 1 and number 2. Okay, so the answer to problem number 1 is x equals 13. The answer to problem number 2 is x equals 21. Moving on, multiplication problems. Same idea. Now this time our problems start off with multiplication, so it's really not that difficult. It's actually pretty easy. So first thing I'm going to do is highlight my variable and put my line on top of the equal sign. Go ahead and bring that line down and bring down your equal sign because you're going to need it anyways. Now, anytime you see a number and the letter beside each other without any symbol, that means multiplication. Now, if it was addition, if there was an addition, it will look like this: x plus 1, 8 plus x. There's a symbol in between the number and the variable. Now, if it was a subtraction, it would be x minus 1. You see, there's a symbol in between the two things. Or x minus 3 or -8 plus x. Now, for multiplication, in between the number and the variable, there's no symbol. There technically is, it's multiplication, but we actually don't write it out. We don't do 2 times x. We just write it out as if they're beside each other. So anytime you see a number and an x beside each other like that without any special symbol, that's implied to be a multiplication, okay? With that being said, once again, if you look at the left side, we have 2 times x. Remember, x hates being with other things on the same side. So my purpose is to move everything away from the x. So I need to move this 2 to the other side. So now, what is the opposite of multiplying by 2? You divide by 2. So I'm going to pick it up and move it over here and divide by 2. So I'm left with x equals 4 divided by 2, which is 2. So my final answer is x equals 2. Okay, let's do that for example 2. Let's start off by highlighting our x and drawing our line so we can be able to determine the left and the right side of the equal sign, and go ahead and write down your equal sign down below. So we're multiplying by -5, so the opposite will be to divide by -5. So x equals 5 divided by -5, which is -1. So if you notice, on the left side of the equal sign, we're left with x, because 5 divided by -5 divided by -5 just becomes 1. So it just basically goes away because the 1 is implied to be there. And on the right side, if we do 5 divided by -5, we're just left with -1. So my final answer is x equals -1. Now, let's highlight our variable for example 3. Draw your line and write down your equal sign again. Now, remember from the other lessons, if there's no number in front of the variable, it's implied to be a 1. That's the case in this problem. Go ahead and write a 1. because there's no number, so it's implied to be a 1, and because there's a negative symbol there, it's a negative 1x. So I'm multiplying by negative 1, so the opposite is to divide by negative 1. Negative 1 divided by negative 1 is just 1, and then bring down your x. Negative 9 divided by negative 1 is just positive 9. Remember, if it has 1x, you can actually just write it as x equals 9 because the 1 is implied to be there. Okay? Go ahead and flip to the second page. At this moment, go ahead and pause the video so you can have the opportunity to work these two problems out. Now, the answer to problem number 1 is x equals negative 2. The answer to problem number 2 is x equals negative 1/2. Or some of you would have left it as negative 9 over 18. This is technically correct, but you would prefer to simplify it. And when you simplify negative 9 over 18, it's just negative 1/2. Okay, let's move on to the last part of today's notes, which is the division problems. Now, if you notice, these problems, the operation going on between the x and the number is division. So let's start off by highlighting our variable and drawing that line on top of the equal sign so I can be able to tell the left from the right side. Now, if you notice, the operation between the x and the division, or the x and the 2, is division. So if I want to move the 2 to the other side, what's the opposite of division? Multiplication. So this is gone. So on the left side of the equal sign, I'm left with x. And on the right side is 3 times 2, which is 6. So my final answer is x equals 6. Go ahead and highlight the x on example 2. Draw yourself your little vertical line. Drop down your equal sign. Now, left side, we have an x divided by negative 2. X has to be by itself. Therefore, I'm going to pick up negative 2 and jailbreak it to the other side. To do that, I have to do the opposite of the operation. If I'm dividing by negative 2, the opposite will be to multiply by negative 2. So on the left side, I have x. On the right side, what is 0.5 times negative 2? That will be negative 1. So my final answer is x equals negative 1. Okay. Let's highlight our x. Bring down your vertical line with your equal sign. Now, you might wonder, Mr. Gomez, how would I solve this? Would I get rid of the 2? Would I do the fraction? What would I do? Well, in this situation, there's actually many ways that you could solve this problem. And the first way would be to get rid of the bottom part of the fraction. Now, that means getting rid of the 2. If I'm going to jailbreak that 2 over, what will be the opposite of the operation going on? Well, if you notice, the operation is divided by 2, so the opposite will be to multiply by 2. So I'm left with 1x on the left side, and on the right side, I'm left with 3 times 2, which is 6. Now we don't have to do anything else, because 1x is the same thing as x equals 6. So my final answer is x equals 6. Now, another way you could have done example 3 was to convert the 1/2 into a decimal. Because remember, I told you, anytime you have fractions, it could be very beneficial just to convert those fractions into decimals. So that's what I might do. 1/2 is the same thing as 0.5 x equals 3. Highlight your x. Drop down your line with your equal sign. Now, how do I move the 0.5 to the other side? Well, if you notice, there's no special symbol between the 0.5 and the x. So this is implied to be multiplication. So the opposite of multiplying by 0.5, to divide by 0.5. So on the left side, I'm left with x. And on the right side, 3 divided by 0.5 is just 6. So my final answer is x equals 6, which is what I got. And there's actually one more way to be able to solve this problem. 1/2 x equals 3. Now, if you multiply this fraction with this x, you could put a 1 under the x. So remember, when you multiply fractions, you multiply straight across. So 1 times x is just x. 2 times 1 is 2. So this becomes the fraction x over 2 equals 3. Doesn't that look familiar? It does. It's example number 1. And of course, you would just solve it exactly like we solved example 1. But there you go. There's multiple ways of solving example number 3. You just got to pick the one that you're more comfortable with, okay? So I'm going to leave that option up to you. Go ahead and pause the video so you can work out problems number 1 and number 2. Okay, so problem number 1, the answer is x equals -5. Problem number 2, the answer is x equals -27. Okay, let's move on to the closure. What operation is going on between the x and the coefficient in the following problem? Okay, so 8x. What operation is going on there? Multiplication. Remember. If only I could spell. Okay. 8x is the same thing as 8 times x. Okay. Now, let me go a little bit further and let me show you what it looks like if it was addition. 8 plus x. You see the plus? Subtraction. 3 minus x. Okay, between the number and the x, there's a minus. And division. 3 divided by x. Okay, if you notice, 8 plus x. Let's go ahead and change the 3 to 8 so we can be consistent. Addition, 8 plus x. Subtraction, 8 minus x. Division, 8 divided by x. Multiplication, there's no fancy symbol. It's just 8x. That's implied to be multiplication. And I understand I'm making a big deal out of this, but this is a common mistake that 8th graders make. So I want to make myself very clear because it will come up again. Example number 2, true or false? 1/2 is the same as 1 divided by 2. Yes, that is true, okay? Because 1/2 is the same thing as 1 divided by 2. So remember that. Anytime you see a fraction symbol, that's the same thing as division. Okay, well, that is all for today. We'll see you tomorrow in class.